Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation. Today I'll be talking about Customized Modular Learning 101, Putting the Pieces Together. A little bit about me. My name is Luba Vangelova. I've written about self-directed learning and the future of education for a number of media outlets. I've also co-founded and managed several co-learning groups in Washington, D.C. And in 2020, I launched the Hub, which is envisioned to grow into an all-ages co-learning, co-working space with both online and in-person options. So what is customized modular learning? It's piecing together elements from one or more sources to create a comprehensive education that meets an individual's needs. If the concept sounds familiar, it's because that's how adults learn. We encounter challenges that require us to learn new skills and knowledge or to grow as people, and we piece together what we need, whether it's from conversations, from websites, from books, from classes, whatever seems appropriate to get from A to B. So why opt for customized modular learning? Because we're all individuals with distinct and dynamic combinations of strengths, weaknesses, preferences, and goals. And as such, we thrive in dynamic, individualized contexts. Thinking again about how adults learn. If you take two successful, however you want to define that term, 40-year-olds, they may find it useful to learn some of the same things, but they also may find it useful to learn some very different things and at different speeds and in different ways. And when people are engaged in learning or work that suits them, when they're feeling challenged by something that is meaningful and that feels attainable with the right support and scaffolding, then they're operating at peak performance. So how do you find or create a customized education? Essentially two options: enroll in a tailored education program or independently create your own tailored education. Most options for young people tend to be rather standardized and static, but there are some exceptions. At the same time, there's also a diverse array of families who are creating their own pathways at a range of price points. So looking at the first option, enrolling in a tailored education program full-time. There are a range of options that allow different levels of tailoring. Some allow a great deal of freedom to learn whatever, however, and whenever one wants. Others have a few required program elements, but also an a la carte menu of classes, workshops, tutoring and mentoring sessions, field trips, and other offerings that are sprinkled throughout each day. Still others have a set curriculum that students are expected to follow, but on a self-paced basis. Not only self-paced, but some of them allow the students to do it in whatever order they choose. And because there isn't much of a need for classroom management, if everyone is doing their own thing in parallel, the curriculum-based part of the learning can take just a fraction of what it would in a conventional classroom. So typically somewhere on the order of 1.5 to 3 hours per day. And this leaves considerable time to then work on individual or group projects, which tend to be the areas in which students are given a lot more leeway in those kinds of programs. So other than flexibility, the way that most of these programs differ are along dimensions like governance, mission, size, family demographics, vibe, and then some of the important logistical issues like whether it's online or in person, the days, hours, the location. And fundamentally though, things can be very similar in a lot of these respects, but what ultimately has the biggest differentiating effect is the people. So if you're looking for something, it's very important to really get a sense of the people who are putting it together. So how to find these programs? Internet search. There are some aggregator sites such as alternativestoschool.com and self-directed ACE.org, which is run by the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. There are local parenting and neighborhood listservs in some areas that can be good resources to ask questions of other parents, you know, what programs they're aware of. There might be education-related discussion groups that could be good resources, and then word of mouth, the old standby. So if not enrolling in a full-time program, whether that's because you just can't find one that appeals to you, or perhaps you just prefer to have more flexibility than any of those offer, the other option is to go the independent route. So even prior to 2020, there were more than 2 million families that had already opted for independent learning, aka homeschooling or hacking an education in the United States alone. And that number continues to grow quite dramatically, in fact, in 2020 since the spring. And then in the case of independent learning, the options and styles are limited only by imagination and resources such as time and money and support network. So who can be an independent learner? You might be thinking, this sounds like it could be a lot of work. Could I do it? Would I want to? Would it you know, suit my family? So just circling back to the original concept of, you know, everyone being an individual, like everything else, it can suit some people and not suit other people. A lot depends on personality, comfort with not having a recipe to follow necessarily, comfort with, you know, ambiguity, resources, not just financial, but family, friends, support network. It can depend on other responsibilities. If a parent has a paying job or elder care or other responsibilities to themselves or to other family members, and how flexible the schedule is for carrying out those responsibilities. And also the ease of connecting with other people who are following a similar path. That often can be a really big determinant in whether this feels like achievable for a family, is how much of a support network they can build among other people who are doing the same thing. And those people don't necessarily have to live in the same geographic area. It can be online relationships that are developed, but it is, of course, always good to have people that you know in the same general area as well. And independent learning can and has been done by two-parent families and by single parents. Usually in the case of single parents, it requires some more creative approaches and more support, and or doing it with older children who can take over some of the responsibilities from parents. And it's been done by parents who have paying work, either part-time or full-time, or who don't. So, you know, it covers a whole spectrum of people who are doing this. In terms of what is involved, I often like to think more in terms of energy rather than time. In the sense of, does something generate more positive energy in your life, or does it drain energy from your life? Because in the end, that can often matter much more than the raw number of hours that are invested in something. Like many things, it can be difficult to really know for sure if something will work or not until it's tried. Which doesn't necessarily mean all or nothing, because some of these principles can be tried on the side, as it were, while remaining enrolled in a full-time program. However, the caveat I would mention there is that if the love of learning has been lost, and if the full-time program is really draining, you know, the learning and just the energy of the individual, then sometimes a hard break, a rest, and a reset may first be needed in order to really have the right frame of mind and to give independent learning a proper trial. So what are the elements of a customized modular education? We can put them into two rough categories: formal, which are the things that those of us who grew up in kind of institutional educational environments, you know, some of these would be familiar to us. And the informal that, you know, sometimes we don't tend to think of as much and associate as much with learning, but learning can equally span, you know, both of these categories, and they're both, you know, equally valid. The informal can include things like conversations with people of any age, really. Any kind of books that aren't explicitly textbooks necessarily. Any kind of websites, even if they're not explicitly educational websites, but that can serve as vehicles for learning. Scratch, for example, is a coding site. DIY is for do-it-yourself kind of maker projects. And YouTube, of course, has videos on just about everything. Peer-to-peer learning, I mean, it's just a great resource for that. Video games, which can be played mindlessly, but can also be played very mindfully and can serve as vehicles for learning all sorts of things, which we'll get to later with some examples. Also other games, self-directed play, reflection, just thinking on your own. And I would also add in there like observation and reflection. Documentaries and other films and all sorts of life activities, including, for example, doctor visits. You know, if a person goes on a doctor visit for themselves or for their family member, they can hear the doctor explaining the diagnosis. There are all sorts of things that can be learned through activities such as cooking, whether it's math, fractions or other math, chemical concepts, physics concepts, also through sports, through really just about any kind of life activity you can imagine can be a vehicle for learning all sorts of things. And then the formal category can include things like part-time programs at what are often referred to as homeschool resource centers. And the programs can be cohort-based, where a child is with the same group of children every day, let's say, or every, let's say 1 or 2 or 3 days a week, every week. Or it can be much more a la carte and casual, where a child is with one group of children in this class and then takes a different class to, you know, do something else with a different group of children and so on. So a lot of that is just basically based on personal preference and interests. Textbooks, pretty self-explanatory. Websites, explicitly educational ones include, for example, the Khan Academy has a lot of videos on all sorts of subjects. That's a very popular one. Then there are quote unquote complete curriculum packages, and I put that in quotes because I mean, nothing can really be a complete life curriculum other than just living your life. But what we think of in terms of conventionally structured by subject curriculum, there are packages that cover that in its entirety the way a school would. For example, Oak Meadow, and there are ones like Prenda that do a lot of Common Core things, but that also have interdisciplinary elements as well. And just because they're quote unquote complete doesn't mean they have to be used in their entirety. You can use whatever makes sense to you to use and discard the rest if you're learning independently. Then there are topic-specific software packages on every, quote unquote subject, and as well as, just kind of more interdisciplinary types of software packages. Class, and same for classes and tutoring sessions, whether they're online or offline. Outschool.com is the biggest provider of online classes, and there are many other people and organizations, though, that provide classes in all sorts of areas. Same for tutoring, can be found in all sorts of subjects, online or offline as well. Field trips and lots of programs. In the past, it was predominantly in person that field trips and a lot of these programs were available, but since the whole COVID thing hit, a lot of things are now being offered online as well, or instead. So how do you put together the pieces on a day-to-day level? Well, that can look like anything that works for families, personalities, and preferences. Again, going back to the idea that we're all individuals. Often one way to start is to look at what the high priority activities are that occur on certain days and at certain times, and then schedule other things around those. A family might take a very flexible approach, and with, let's say, a heavy emphasis on doing projects, but then also in amidst working on the projects, fit in a more intentional way core skills development, let's say using software programs in math, language arts, and so on. Another family may have a very set daily schedule that they follow quite religiously, which can look like, for example, doing academic work in the mornings and doing all sorts of other things in the afternoons. Some families prefer to use a big picture approach where they set certain goals for a specific period of time, and then they break them up into milestones and work backwards to develop a weekly or daily schedule to try and ensure that they're meeting those milestones. With the flexibility, of course, that they can pivot at any time if something isn't working. And that's the case in all of these approaches. And one of the benefits of doing this independently is that you can pivot at any time and try something different. And then there are families that prefer to be very unstructured and just kind of go with the flow, see, what they feel like doing on any given day, what they feel like learning on any given week, with perhaps just very limited commitment to structured things or scheduled things. So it really depends on the individuals and the families as a whole. And so there are some websites that have examples of some daily schedules, such as schoolclosures.org. It has some examples of how the pieces can be put together at different ages. And they also have examples of curriculum packages and other resources. And again, as was mentioned earlier about the time commitment, here, as in a full-time program that's tailored, there's no classroom management requirements. So any kind of academic structured work can be often done in 3 hours or less per day, leaving a lot of time to do other more discretionary things. And in terms of projects and how people come up with project ideas, one tool that can be useful in that regard is to have what some people refer to as like a wonder wall, where the children and adults also can post questions or things they're curious about, wondering about, contemplating. And then those can be grouped into themes in order to look for some bigger, meatier questions that can be explored. And then there are other tools like Kanban boards that can be used to track projects as they go from just brainstorming all the way to being completed. So there are a lot of tools out there that can be used to help with this type of learning. The primary challenge, because I mean, nothing is without its challenges for independent learners, is community and connection. Families with independent learners tend to form supportive social circles, but it can be difficult to maintain a consistent cohort, especially as children get older, as interests diverge, as schedules become more complicated. And the logistics can also take their toll as well. Project managing things and shuttling around in person for a class or activity here or there. It can wear people down, especially when there are multiple children and parents trying to fulfill other responsibilities or needs. One way to mitigate this is to join an online or in-person community. And that can take a lot of the pressure off each individual parent because it can be either groups of parents taking turns to offer things and support each other, or that can be complemented or instead done by a professional facilitator. There are lots of different ways that this can be done. And some of the ways to find out about these are, again, looking at some of the aggregator sites like alternativestoschool.com or selfdirected.org, or the other resources previously mentioned, the discussion forums, listservs, word of mouth, etc. So a lot of parents tend to wonder, how do you assess learning if your child is following a customized learning pathway? One way to think about this is to think back to when the children were babies or toddlers, and how did you know then that they were developing physically, socially, emotionally, intellectually? It's in some ways not that different later on because it often relies on observation and intuition. Are they setting, or are you setting goals for them? Are they setting goals for themselves and managing to meet bigger goals over time? Keeping a portfolio, looking back at things like, you know, how was the child writing a year ago versus how they're writing now? Are they using more complex sentences? Are they using developing more complex storylines? Are they able to handle more advanced math concepts? How are the questions they've been asking over time changing? And what kinds of things have they been able to accomplish that they weren't able to accomplish a year ago or 2 years ago? Are they able to resolve conflicts better now? Are they able to communicate more clearly? Has their spelling improved? Just kind of really being mindful and making visible a lot of the things that are not necessarily that visible. It can help to think about, for instance, how did you know that a child was learning something while you were on a vacation when there weren't tests or quizzes or anything? Sometimes you can tell by the engagement level of a child, you know, how intently they're listening to something, how much they talk about it later. There are all sorts of kind of clues to look for if you're observant and mindful and open to that. It also can help to put things in writing, to make visible the things that are not so visible. So one example is learning that flowed from playing video games. This was compiled by Pamela Riccia, who has written some books and has a website about self-directed education. And she decided one day to actually write down what her child's some learning that stemmed from playing video games. And it ranged from learning about Japanese language and culture to story analysis and social growth and research skills, data management, and learning about themselves. I mean, there are all sorts of things in addition to intellectual growth as well, of course, that constitute human development. So that's kind of an interesting example that it's one way to make the invisible more visible, is to actually really write it down and kind of look at the learning that is happening basically all the time if someone is living a life. And another documentation example would be an overview, which can be done like this or can be done any other way, that can accompany a portfolio of samples. Sometimes portfolios are required by state regulators. And so in those cases, they often ask for them to be segmented by the same sort of subjects that are taught in conventional schools. So, you know, that's, that can be one way to present the information and then keep some samples of each subject within a portfolio. And that can also then be useful for the parents to look back over time and see how the samples in the portfolio have changed and how they show growth over time. So one thing to point out is that when things are segmented into academic subjects like this, it does leave out the all-important, you know, what are called by some people soft skills. So it can be useful for parents to also, if they're keeping track in a way like this, to also try and remember to look at also the growth that is happening in all the other ways that are not covered in this kind of rubric. So finally, where can you find help in putting the pieces together if you get stuck, if you're unsure, if you're just need some validation that you're on the right track? So homeschool groups, a lot of the conversations now happen on Facebook. If you're not a fan of Facebook, understandably so, then listservs, there are still some listservs on which there are conversations happening around independent learning. There are groups that meet in person, and often though the way to find those groups is through Facebook or through listservs. But once you meet one person, whether in person or online, it's often the case that they can then connect you to other people, and eventually you can find kind of a support group that of which you can ask questions and on all sorts of things that come up. then how to find groups in other ways. Again, the aggregator sites that were mentioned previously, Alternatives to School and selfdirected.org. They have lists of individual members as well as organizations in different areas. And finally, if you just really get stuck and strike out in all those ways, or you just want more tailored tailored support in doing a tailored education. There are professional consultants that specialize in different things, such as how to get started with independent learning, how to do interest-based learning, how to put together something specific like a math program or a comprehensive curriculum, how to deal with children with learning differences, perhaps things like profoundly gifted children, or who specialize in different geographic areas and what the regulations are in those areas and how to meet them. In the end, learning, like life, it's about the journey, not the destination. So enjoy the journey and good luck.